Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook to watch our latest interviews. And of course, head over to our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our humanitarian and advocacy efforts across the globe. Well, much of Lower Manhattan's long history is well known. It's where the Dutch founded New Amsterdam, one of the battlegrounds of the American Revolution, where George Washington took the first presidential oath of office and is today the anchor of the world's principal financial center. And while Lower Manhattan's Jewish history, particularly the Lower East Side, is rich and well documented, one aspect remains underappreciated, yet hidden in plain sight. It's synagogues, past and present. My guest today grew up on the Lower East Side, immersed in its immigrant culture and nostalgia. Historian and educator Bradley Shaw is a licensed tour guide and is an expert on the history of New York City with an emphasis on the area in which he grew up. Brad currently gives walking tours for the museum at Eldridge Street, the Lower East Side Jewish Conservancy, and his own company, Blue Shoes Tours. He's also been a lecturer and previously a manager at the museum at Eldridge Street for several years. Brad and I will explore the evolution of New York's Lower East Side through the fate of its synagogues, the ones still there, ones that have been lost, and the ones transformed to fit the needs of a rapidly changing and more diverse neighborhood. Brad, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, Dan.
Well, before we embark on our walk through the Lower East Side, I want to establish that B'nai B'rith was founded in this very area at some place called Singheimer's Cafe in 1843. It was on Essex Street. So our roots run very deep in Lower Manhattan. So the first question is, what inspired your interest in New York City history? Tell us about your experiences growing up in the area and how you developed a love for your neighborhood.
I was born on the Lower East Side. I actually spent there the first 3 or 4 years of my life. And both of my parents were born and raised on the Lower East Side. And my grandparents actually came from the Pale of Settlement and, and settled on the Lower East Side. So starting out there gave me the interest. And when I was younger, even though we had moved away, we had actually moved to the projects in Brooklyn. But my father's mother still lived on the Lower East Side, and we went there every single weekend. So that just gave me an unbelievable feeling whenever I went to the Lower East Side. And when I got older, and I've been going there, and I'm 68 now, so I've been going there for my entire life. And I have always gone down there, whether it was for shopping and just to walk around or to eat. That was terrific. And then I got into IT and was a vice president at JP Morgan Chase for a while. And then when I left there, I decided to go back with what I really liked, which was history and teaching. And I went down to the museum at Eldridge Street. I'd never been there before, and I immediately volunteered. And just walking around the neighborhood all the time just gives me such a feeling that you really can't realize.
Yeah, I can really identify with it. We lived in New York for almost 9 years. Even the street names on the Lower East Side, of course, Hester Street being perhaps the best known because of the movie, but all of the street names, the famous street names that are attached to Jewish life on the Lower East Side really kind of jump out at you. In fact, I mean, there are so many families, Jewish families in this country that have a connection. While my mother was raised in Maine, her father, when he came here originally, and they went back and they brought the family back, lived on Allen Street for a while. So many really have a connection. Now, I think the largest year of Jewish immigration to the United States may have been 1914 or so. Most of those folks who came in went to New York, not all of them to the Lower East Side, but tell us what the Lower East Side might have looked like, let's say, in 1914.
The Lower East Side in 1914 was the most crowded area in the world. I mean, talk about modern day Mumbai. It was more crowded than that. The streets were, it was almost shoulder to shoulder in the streets. These people that came over here, remember, you're settling in 1880. There are 60,000 Jews in the United States, probably about 40,000, I would say, around New York. By 1924, when immigration ended because of the Reed-Johnson Act, there were almost 2 million Jews, of about 1.6 being in New York, and most of them being on the Lower East Side. So you've got to realize that when you walk the area now, it is part of, more or less, a part of Chinatown. A lot of it, you see a lot of Chinese writing, but back then, every sign was in Yiddish. And so if you go there, just imagine every Chinese sign that you see there being in Yiddish, and the language of the streets was Yiddish. So that's what everybody is speaking. Now we're talking about the Jewish Lower East Side, which encompasses the East Village. So it goes up to about 14th Street, and anything below 3rd Avenue. East of 3rd Avenue was considered the Jewish Lower East Side, and it was the most crowded neighborhood on earth.
We've seen these pictures and postcards, the old postcards of push carts in the streets, and it crowded, I guess, would really be an understatement. Over the years, how have the boundaries of the Lower East Side changed in terms of reference?
Well, now we have anything above Houston Street is considered the East Village, and that was part of the Lower East Side. As people started to make some money, and as these Jews who came over in the 1880s and the 1890s started to realize the American dream, they started to move out. And as they moved out, the neighborhood started to change. The neighborhood was primarily Jewish until probably in the 1950s. I think my family moved out in 1957. After that, the neighborhood started to change and morph into another immigrant neighborhood, which was from Puerto Rico. And after the Puerto Ricans actually started to realize that American dream also, and they decided to move out of the area, well, then the area becomes South American and Dominican. And again, it's a pattern that these immigrant people who move in there realize the American dream, start to make money, and want to move out into someplace that's better. And when they move into someplace that's better, that they move out of the neighborhood. So the neighborhood has changed distinctly. Now, the neighborhood, and especially the neighborhood around the Eldridge Street Synagogue and that part of the Lower East Side, is now part of Chinatown. So the neighborhood has changed drastically over the last 80 years or so.
But for years, even after the Jews had gone to other places to live, there were many Jewish businesses, restaurants that remained into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and perhaps even beyond. What has survived today?
There really isn't a lot survived. On Orchard Street, you had a lot of foundation places. They were underwear places, and people used to go there all the time for socks and underwear. And I remember doing it, and you would go there. But most of those places have gone away. There were a lot of places that sold clothes, and most of those places have also gone away. The only things that really survived down there are some of the food places. Places like Russ and Daughters, which was an appetizing, it's now a restaurant too, but an appetizing store since the 1900s. You also have Jonas Schimmel's Knishes, which I believe has been there since about 1918, and those are both on Houston Street. And also the most famous place that you have here, one of the places that survived, was Cass's Deli, which is on Ludlow and also Houston Street, and they have survived. The other things that have survived is that occasionally, there are some synagogues that really did survive. Most have not, but there are really some synagogues down on the Lower East Side that have survived all this transition.
Before we get into the synagogues, because really I want to have a discussion about that. But let's talk about the landmarks that are still there. The Forward Building, Yarmolinsky's bank, I guess now has become a new hotel. Tell us about some of those sitting landmarks, which played an important role in the life of the Lower East Side in the days of a big Jewish community there.
One of the famous landmarks down there, besides those two, is the Educational Alliance. The Educational Alliance is on East Broadway. Educational Alliance was sort of a settlement house, which basically was a way to get these people who were moving from another country settled. And the Educational Alliance is famous because it was started as these people moved from the different countries from Europe. The Jews that were here already, basically the German Jews who had made it here in America already, saw that these people were not as educated, and they were actually afraid that they were going to give the Jews a bad name. And they said that we have to get these people assimilated as quickly as possible. So they formed places like the Educational Alliance. And what the Educational Alliance was in charge of was assimilating these people. The other buildings there is the Forwards Building. And the Forwards Building is very, very interesting because this Jewish newspaper that everybody is familiar with, that basically now only publishes online, by the way, and it was a bastion of socialist thinking. And it is now high-priced condos, which is sort of a real irony. The Yarmolinsky Bank, Sender Yarmolinsky was one of the founders of the museum at Eldridge Street. He was one of the ones that put $10,000 in and helped them get a mortgage to build the place in 1887. He was a very, very famous banker, and he was considered the J.P. Morgan of the Lower East Side. And he made his money by selling passage tickets from Europe to the United States. Basically, what would happen is that if they were charging $40 for a passage ticket, he would buy thousands of them at $20 each, and he'd sell them for $30. Basically, he got rich, and the other people saved some money doing it. But he builds this in his later years. He builds this magnificent structure on Orchard Street and Canal, and he only lived 3 or 4 months after it was complete. And the bank was put in charge of his sons, who were not as good with money. And when World War I started, the bank got dissolved, unfortunately. But the building's been there for since then, and it is now a luxury hotel. And I go by there every single day, and it is actually amazing what they did with it. The great thing is that if you're in the area, again, this is Canal and Orchard Street, you can walk into the lobby, and the lobby still looks like it did when it was a bank. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's a striking, architecturally striking building, considering the surroundings. I mean, it really stands out. You mentioned the Forward, and we'll get to the synagogues here in just a moment. You mentioned the Forward, of course, which was on East Broadway. But that block or two, I think, was called the Jewish Fleet Street, because there were other newspapers that were also published. My father was a subscriber to Der Tag Morgen Journal, and they were located just a building or two away from the Forward. So it was quite a place for what was then really a growing and very successful Jewish press. That was the media of its day, the big media of its day.
Yeah, interesting. Down the block from the Forwards Building, 2 blocks away, was something called Stiebel Row. Stiebel Row were these little congregations, and what they did is they rented out tenement apartments and made them synagogues. And there are these little communities, like if you came from a small town and you didn't want to join any of these big congregations, what you would do is you would all get together, put in some money, and you would basically rent a tenement apartment, and you would make that a synagogue. And these were called Stiebels. Well, 2 blocks from the Educational Alliance and a few blocks from the Forwards, There were probably in one block, there were probably 30 or 40 synagogues in these tenement buildings, of which I believe only two survive today.
Of course, on the other side of the forward building, and to the right, if you were looking at it head on, was the Garden Cafeteria, which
Yes.
has a history of its own as a Jewish dairy restaurant. But let's talk about the synagogues. The first synagogue built in the neighborhood was when?
The first synagogue was built in 1849, and that was Anshe Chesed, and that was on Norfolk Street off of Houston. It was built as a Reformed German congregation. They built the place in 1849, and that's the building that is still there. Actually, it was Temple Emmanuel was on Christie Street, and that was in that time. The first synagogue, though built in the neighborhood, was probably around there. I'm not sure exactly which one it was, but the 1849 Anshe Chesed German, that is the existing synagogue building in the area.
When the synagogue landscape started to take shape, was there an intention, an effort to be creative in terms of the architecture? So, in other words, are they all different?
When people started moving into the area, you come from another country, you need three things. You need a place to live, you need a place to work, and especially these are Orthodox Jews, so you need a place to worship. They started to worship in storefronts and basements and tenement apartments, and they were content with that. It wasn't until about 1886 when they built a museum at Eldridge Street, which was the first grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jews, that they started to get creative. They hired these two architects called the Herder brothers, and they told them, make it as opulent as you can, and they did. And it's a beautiful Moorish building. After that, well, then other synagogues were able to other congregations were able to, get some money together, and they said, well, if they can build it, we can build it. So where it started off very, very simple, they started to build grander and grander. And if you didn't have the money to build a grand synagogue, well, sometimes what you would do is that there were a lot of churches in the area. And what you would do is you would take over one of these large churches and you would make it to suit your congregation. So yes, they tried to be a little different, each one of them. Like there's the one in 1840, the one that was built in 1849. Well, that was copied after the cathedral in Cologne. It's a Gothic synagogue, which, if you know anything about synagogues, they almost were never Gothic. I only know of two Gothic synagogues in the United States, and each one put their little mark on the synagogue to make sure. And why? You got to realize that there were 500 synagogues in the Lower East Side. Well, why did you want to make it different? You wanted to make a difference because you wanted to attract congregants. So the nicer the synagogue, and the more the more opulent or the more comfortable that you would have, that's how you would attract people.
Well, you talked about Stiebel Row, and then you have these beautiful synagogues. Was it a function of one's economic station in life to go to the more opulent than to the Stiebel? Who were the congregants, let's say, in the Eldridge Street Synagogue?
There is a story about basically the Eldridge Street Synagogue was something for everybody. In truth, I don't believe it was. The people with some money, those were the people that stayed at the Eldridge Street Synagogue, and the reason is that the seats, which you had to pay for the most part, were a little more expensive. I mean, to sit up front, you had to pay $3,000. Which was it's crazy. You're talking about $35,000 today. So it's nice to believe that yes, everybody was welcome in every single synagogue, but there were some synagogues that were absolutely were the place for the people that had a little more means to them, And even though these synagogues did reach out to the community and did help and were meeting halls and other things like that, yes, there was a certain station in life that you would have, and that depended on which synagogue you went to.
What are some of the other notable synagogues that existed, may not exist today, or that are there that you point out on your walking tours?
Some very interesting places that I point out. One is, again, is that Anshe Chesed, which is a beautiful Gothic building. My home base is the museum at Eldridge Street. The museum at Eldridge Street was built in 1887, and it was the first grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jews. That is to note. The Eldridge Street Synagogue is very noteworthy because it was built in 1887. By about 1950, they realized that they couldn't keep up the building anymore, and they closed the upper sanctuary, the main sanctuary, and they only worshiped downstairs in the Bet Midrash. They worshiped there for about 20 years, and they let the upstairs sanctuary go to pot. In fact, they let the whole building go to pot, and they were just worshiping still in the basement. They didn't care about anything. Well, in the 1970s, a man by the name of Gerard Wolfe is writing a book called The Synagogues of the Lower East Side. And he comes upon the building and he bribes the guy who's taking care of the place to let him in. And he walks into the place and the hair on the back of his neck stands up because he sees this beautiful, beautiful 19th century Moorish synagogue that is in complete and utter disrepair. I mean, all the windows are out. There are pigeons living in the roof. And he can't believe it. He realizes he's got to save it. And he starts the process, which eventually is taken up by Roberta Brandes-Gratz, who's a preservationist. And whereas the synagogue was built in 10 months, from 1987 to 2007, it cost them $20 million in 20 years to restore the place. So when you go there now, you see this beautiful restored 19th century structure, which is pretty unbelievable. That's actually the first place that I start on my tour. I then go around the corner, and there's the synagogue that started out as Anshe Poland, which is now St. Barbara's Greek Orthodox Church. And it's been that way since the 1930s. Some others that I go on is the Romaniot Synagogue, which is on Broome Street. You always talk about Ashkenazi and Sephardim, but there are also Romaniot Jews who come from northern Greece and that area over there. And that synagogue is still active. Another synagogue that I love to go to is Este Warschauer. Este Warschauer is on Rivington Street. And this synagogue on Rivington Street still retains the outside because the outside was landmarked, but inside the place was basically gutted and is now an art studio. And the one that I go to that's actually not there anymore. It's basically just it's an empty lot. Was the Romanian American Synagogue, the first Romanian American congregation, which was a converted church, which was considered the Cantor's Carnegie Hall. And you're talking about Yosel Rosenblatt and Jan Pierce and Pinchas Minkowski, and they all sang there. And this place was an 1850s converted church. It was a magnificent building, and unfortunately, because it wasn't taken care of, it collapsed in 2006. But that's just some of the places that I go to.
Did some of these synagogues, as the neighborhood changed, did some of the synagogues relocate to other places in the New York area, or that was it? Once they left and they fell into disrepair, as you've just described, that was kind of the last chapter. What happened?
That was more or less the last chapter. It really was. Yes, some of them did. Again, Anshe Chesed, the place that's on Houston and Norfolk, well, they morphed and merged and became Temple Emmanuel. And they're part of Temple Emmanuel now. And a lot of these other congregations, obviously, when a synagogue closes, the congregants have to go somewhere. So they basically were absorbed into other places. And as these places, now these are all Orthodox Jews, as the Orthodox Jews move right? Obviously, they join other congregations. But for the most part, right, when a synagogue becomes abandoned or it gets sold over to a church or something like that, a lot of the congregants they just join another synagogue. So unfortunately, no, they really don't reform somewhere else. Some of them did, but for the most part, they did not.
I'm curious, with people who go on your walking tours, are these mostly folks who have a connection, a family connection? Are they people who are interested in the history, New York City, the history of the Lower East Side? Is it a mix? What kind of folks go on the tours?
It's definitely a mix. I get a whole mix of people because they are interested in the history. And this is my, again, my synagogue walking tour is only one tour that I do. But for that one, I usually do get these people, and it's mostly people that have that connection to the Lower East Side. And they said, "Oh yes, I remember when it was. I remember when it was like that." These people are very interested in what the neighborhood has become. But then again, I get a lot of the curiosity people who basically are into the history, who have heard something about the Lower East Side, or again, you're talking about maybe 90% of all Jews in the United States have a connection to the Lower East Side. It's got to be at least 90%. And they come down there and say, "Oh, I remember my great grandfather talking about coming through the Lower East Side and living here." And they just want to get to know where their ancestors were from.
I want to ask you, Brad, about the future. What does it hold for that part of Manhattan? I know a few years ago the Streit's matzah factory closed, and that was you'd walk by and there was Shapiro's Wine, and there were all of these places, Gertel's Bakery, all of these kind of landmark places that had remained, and now they're gone. Are there projects being developed or intended to preserve the neighborhood's legacy?
The Lower East Side Jewish Conservancy gives tours and gives and basically tries to support any existing Jewish organization that's still in the area. The neighborhood as a whole, again, the neighborhood went from the Jewish Lower East Side, and then other immigration places came in, and then a lot of the neighborhood now has been absorbed into Chinatown. But I see the neighborhood changing again. Is it becoming more Jewish again? No, it isn't. But it is gentrifying. The neighborhood is gentrifying in leaps and bounds. In fact, when in the 1970s, you did not even go to the neighborhood in the day. Forget about the night. You didn't come there in the day. The neighborhood was in such bad shape. But now, as people are moving back to Manhattan, the neighborhood is gentrifying. It is, and especially above Houston Street, and it's actually working its way towards Delancey Street now. The neighborhood is getting newer and newer with new buildings going in. Unfortunately, with those new buildings, that means that the tenements are being knocked down, and I have mixed feelings about that. Yes, the neighborhood has got to change, and it's got to move with the future, but I am always sorry when they knock down one of those old tenements, because with knocking that down, they're also knocking down some history.
Yeah, I mean, what you say about the landmarks, it really is so important. I know I used to go down when I was in college. I was in New Hampshire, but I used to go to New York on vacations. And my father was a pretty knowledgeable guy. He was also a Hebrew school teacher, and I would occasionally go to the Hebrew Publishing Company, which was on Delancey Street, beautiful, magnificent building, to buy him some books, or I'd buy him some phonograph records or whatever. And one hopes that there will really be an effort to, even though it may not be all declared as a historic district, I guess New York, it would be very difficult for New York to do that, that many of these landmarks will remain, so people like yourself can continue to tell the story. Now, for those of us who want to learn more or to get involved, how can people help celebrate and preserve the Jewish heritage of the Lower East Side?
What you want to do is you want to come down and you want to go to places like the Tenement Museum. You want to go to places like the museum at Eldridge Street. You want to get involved in organizations like the Lower East Side Jewish Conservancy. And the reason for that is that they are trying to preserve the area. Just come down and enjoy the neighborhood. You really can. As you get more and more people that come down and enjoy the neighborhood retains some of its old charm. Come down and see the Lower East Side. It is a truly magnificent area. It really is. Just come down and see it, and make sure that that these places that are there, like the Tenement Museum, like the museum at Eldridge Street, like some other places there, that basically that they continue to survive and that they don't get taken over.
And finally, where can folks find out more information about your tours?
I work for the Lower East Side Jewish Conservancy. I also work for the museum at Eldridge Street. If you get onto their websites, you will see some tours. And I am actually giving a tour on October 30th, 2022. And then I'm giving 2 tours in December. And, you can see there. But I also have my own tour company called Blue Shoes Tours. And that's where I do private tours. And I can take you around to all these places on the Lower East Side that maybe that you remember or you have heard about. I absolutely love doing my tours. I'm retired. I don't do this for the money. I do this because I enjoy taking people around and showing them the neighborhood that I was born in.
Well, Brad, your love for the Lower East Side and everything that it's meant to so many Jewish immigrants and the larger American Jewish community shines through so clearly. So thank you again for sharing your expertise with us and for being here. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks very much, Dan. I appreciate it.
Well, our gratitude to historian Bradley Shaw for walking us through the history of Manhattan's Lower East Side through its famed synagogues and sharing his love for the neighborhood. And of course, thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed the interview, make sure you check all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work, including our efforts in supporting Ukrainian refugees, as well as those who are still within Ukraine's borders more than 8 months into the war. For my guest, Bradley Shaw, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.